All right, in this video, we'll finish up the skeletal system by talking about joints. Joints are also called articulations. These are sites where two or more bones meet. Makes sense. Functions of the joints are to give the skeleton mobility, to hold the skeleton physically together. Here's a picture of some woodworking joints, and they basically serve the same purpose as skeletal joints. Again, gives the skeleton strength, stability, but also functional mobility as well. There are two classifications of joints. You have structural joints and you have functional classifications. And so we'll go over the functional classifications first because they're going to be kind of a mention them here and then not talk about them again. And the majority of this video will be spending looking at structural joints. So the functional classifications are synarthroses or synarthrotic joints, amphiarthrotic joints, and diarthrotic joints. And this is, again, these are functional. How much movement do they allow? And so synarthrotic are immovable. That's syn, it means no. And so amphi means like both. And so don't think of it as being a lot of movement, slightly movable joints, maybe like a vertebra or something like that. And then diarthrotic joints, these are freely movable. Think about your shoulder joint, that sort of thing. And the structural joints, there's three major classes of them. I'm going to go over them in class, but here they are, or go over them in the video. They're fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. And we're going to go over each one of those in turn. First, we're going to look at fibrous joints. So there are different kinds of fibrous joints. A couple things just generally about them. These are bones joined by dense fibrous connective tissue. So if you think of fibrous joints, think of connective tissue, think of maybe intramembranous skeleton as well. These joints have no joint cavity. They are mostly immovable types of joints. And there are three types of fibrous joints. There are sutures. These are found in the skull, of course. There are syndesmoses or syndesmosis. And these are joints that are exclusively by ligaments. And so you see like the joint between the two lower leg bones here, the fibula and the tibula. Not a whole lot of movement here between these two. This joint is just there to keep them together. You also see this in your forearm as well. And then the last one is gomphosis. And this has to do with, think of like a peg and a socket, or like think of a nail being driven into something. And this is exclusively talking about the teeth joint. When your teeth fit inside the jaw bones, that is that gomphosis type joint. These are fibrous joints. Cartilaginous joints. These are bones united by cartilage. Think of anytime there's cartilage on the bones, think of that's where you're going to find it. And so like fibrous joints, there's no joint cavity, and so not a lot of movement between these joints. There are two types. You see them here. Synchondroses, and I know that looks just like syndesmoses. Just remember that CHON stands for cartilage, and that'll help you. Synchondroses. These are the where hyaline cartilage joins, and so think of like costal cartilages. The epiphyseal plate also has that, and then you have symphyses or symphysis, and these are where there is a symphysis type joint, and so this are a fibrous cartilage joint. And so you think of like the pubic symphysis or the intervertebral discs. Also, anywhere you have that fibrocartilage, you have this type of joint. And then the one that we mostly think about when we think of joints are called synovial joints. Synovial joints are separated by a fluid-filled cavity, and all of these are diarthrotic joints, meaning they're freely movable joints. Almost all limb joints represent this kind of synovial joint structure. And they all have this basic structure here. There's an articular cartilage. It consists of this hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of the bones. This protects the bone ends, prevents them from being crushed. They all have a synovial cavity or a joint cavity, and this contains fluid, and this is again unique to synovial joints. They have this articular capsule, which kind of protects the joint, and they have the synovial fluid, of course, which lubricates, nourishes that cartilage, and so it's got some nourishment in there. It also lubricates, keeps everything moving well, and it also contains phagocytic cells. These are cells that just go around and remove microbes, and they eat things that may be in the joint, and they keep the joint cavity clean. You also have, of course, you have some different ligaments associated with this, and you have blood vessels and nerves as well. But these are the main parts of what you see in a synovial joint. There are different kinds of synovial joints, and this is typically what we think of when we think of a joint. There are plane joints, and think of a flat plane. If you have two flat planes on, they're sliding past one another. So this is a gliding joint. This is like the bones between your wrists and your ankle bones. Great example of a plane joint. A hinge joint. A hinge joint is a uniaxial joint. That's an important word, meaning there's one axis of movement. Think of a door when you think of the hinge joint. Like your elbow is a great example of this. It has one axis of movement. It doesn't do anything else. If it does, it breaks. All right, so it's not good. There's a pivot joint. Again, another uniaxial movement. Think of pivoting around a single point. And a good example of this is where the radius and the ulna meet. They spin past one another, allows you to turn your hand. There's only one axis of movement. It doesn't do anything else. Then there's a couple of biaxial movement joints. There's the condylar joint and the saddle joint. Hard to talk about the difference here. You can kind of see the pictures. This condylar joint is the joints of, you can see here, of the fingers between the palm here and the finger joints. So you can kind of think about how your fingers are able to move in lots of directions. But there's still not a whole lot of joint there, or a whole lot of movement, not a very wide range. Whereas the saddle joint, this is like the joint of your thumb, and a lot more range with this saddle joint. Still a biaxial movement. They call it a saddle joint because you can see the little legs sit down on the saddle here. So there's a lot more movement here. You can move back and forth, forward and backward, side to side. That's why they call it biaxial. And so I would just recognize these two based on the examples. Condylar joint is the fingers. The biaxial joint, or the saddle joint, is the thumb. And then, of course, the ball and socket joint. This has to do with your shoulders and your leg sockets. And these have multi-axial movements. Shoulders, obviously, much more movable than the leg joint. And so let's talk about a couple of imbalances that can occur. Here's a picture of your knee joint. It's the largest, most complex joint of the body. The joint capsule is thin, and it is almost completely absent anteriorly, meaning toward the front. That's where you have your kneecap. There are at least 12 bursa, or those cartilage sacs, associated with the knee joint. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong with knee joints. And the common knee injuries involve what are called the 3 C's. You can have damage to these collateral ligaments. These are usually known as the LCL or the MCL. This is the outside of the knee, inside of the knee. This prevents the knee from racking back and forth. There is the cruciate ligaments, the ACL, anterior cruciate, and the PCL, the posterior cruciate, and these keep the knee from moving forward and backwards too much. And these 4 ligaments here are commonly injured. And then there's the cartilage, or the meniscus. You can have a torn meniscus or something like that. And so these 3 C's, collateral, cruciate, and cartilages, are typically what you see injured with knees. A couple other things. I'll use this picture to talk about tendonitis, but I'll also talk about sprains. You've heard about sprains. You've probably sprained your ankle or something at one point. And a sprain is just when these ligaments here that reinforce, particularly your ankle, these little ligaments that reinforce those joints, when they become stretched or torn, that's called a sprain. So that's a common term used for that. However, tendonitis is a type of inflammatory disease when you have these things that are called tendon sheaths. I don't know if I have another picture. You have one on your wrist as well. It's common. That's where you have carpal tunnel syndrome. That tendon sheath on the wrist is called the carpal tunnel. Carpals are in your wrist. Makes sense. This is a tunnel. Go through it. And so what happens is this tendon that goes through this tendon sheath gets just inflamed. And so that's what tendonitis is. It's very common at joints. Bursitis is just where you have an inflammation of that bursa between the joints, usually caused by some sort of friction or a blow to that joint. And then there's arthritis. Arthritis is a catch-all kind of term. There are 100 different types, or 100 plus different types of inflammatory and degenerative diseases that are classified as arthritis. Typically, arthritis is associated with age, just as the joints age and start to deteriorate over time. There are arthritic type diseases that can affect younger people, but these are typically known as autoimmune diseases and affect you regardless of your age.